Okay, I want to talk about the programme for government, and actually Neil's better off paired with me than he is paired with Jude McCandless, because this is like the Statler and Waldorf bit to finish off the show, where we tell you the things that are perhaps less palatable and more of a challenge. A wee bit of a history lesson first. Programme for government, we're now entering into, I can't remember how many we've got, John's down in the audience, he'll tell me, I think it's 4 or 5 different programmes for government, but the most significant of those probably come after the restoration of devolution back in 2007. And you can look at each of them in turn, and in the one sentence review, which people like Quentin like to write sometimes, you can say 2007 and 2011 was essentially about having a programme for government where the most important thing probably was to sustain a level of institutional stability. Simply keeping the Assembly from having one of those great suspensions during which Quentin and I used to have long conversations in the earlier days of the decade was the most important thing, and was itself a measure of the success of that period of the mandate. From 2011 to 2015, the programme for government on which we're currently working, we worked up a series of actions and essentially activities, things that the government wanted to be doing, things that ministers wanted to be seen to do in order to deliver an impact into people's lives. We had 5 priorities, 82 commitments. We had, and it was interesting talking about the equality agenda, horizontal principles. And within government, in terms of the management of that, the delivery of that process, we had this very structured process where we allocated out the responsibilities for the delivery of these activities across different government departments. And there was an SRO, a senior responsible officer, for each one of those commitments. And when we do a review of how well did we do from 2011 to 15, the report card says actually we did pretty well. We've got over 80% of those commitments delivered, as defined by what it said in the programme itself. But there were many aspects of it in which it simply wasn't a joined up programme, and people have talked for all of that period and longer about having better joined up government, in particular government that operated between the central level and the local level. So it's important when we're looking at what's the role of the programme for government, or the relationship of the programme for government with what's going on in terms of community planning at the local level, that we begin to think about that. And as we came to the end of that period from 11 to 15, there was a change in the legislation which meant that the mandate was extended for a year. We had to bolt on an extra year's worth of activities for 2015-16. But nevertheless, towards the end of the original period, we began to do a review of it, and we looked at some of the things that we were trying to get out of it. And essentially what that said was we need to move away from this delivery focus and towards more of this model, which, as has already been referred to, was beginning to take root in Scotland, moving towards an outcomes focus and away from a delivery focus, moving away from individual activities towards looking at what would make a difference in terms of an impact in people's lives. And that generated for us a series of issues. And like Neil, I can talk all day about any one of these slides, but I won't dally on this one. But there are a range of issues that we identified from having a delivery focus and trying to move across from that into the outcomes focus. And in particular, this idea that we ought to focus what we were doing on delivering outcomes for people. What would make a difference in people's lives? And the way in which we think we do it is to develop a performance framework for the programme for government, which again learns lessons from the Scottish experience. To have this overall programme sitting across everything that happens across the public sector, not just in central government, but embracing local government, but also embracing what goes on in both the private sector and the voluntary and community sector. That we should identify for ourselves a series of outcomes that would make a difference in the lives of the people, the citizens who ministers are elected to serve, who we as public servants are there to provide a service to. And those frameworks then should direct and lead and give a very clear steer to whatever it is, the activities that we're engaged in, whatever we're delivering, whether that is joined up executive strategies, the health strategy for making life better, or other strategies around community relations, around education systems, the whole every school a good school policy. How do we deliver that, and what difference does it make in people's lives? What do we do then whenever we have specific initiatives that we generally deliver from the centre, and we're responsible, I think it said in my title at the beginning, Programme for Government and Delivering Social Change. We have a series of delivering social change initiatives, many of which you'll be familiar with in the city here, around things like social investment, the childcare strategy, efforts that we've tried to do around developing some of the signature programmes around literacy and numeracy, social enterprise, trying to make a difference in the early intervention in children's lives, both in health and welfare generally. And how do we link that then to community plans? When we have this focus on an outcomes-based approach, we ask ourselves a series of questions. We very much bought into a methodology that came across from the States. Mark Friedman, Trying Hard is Not Good Enough, a book I can recommend you, and I don't get any commission on his book sales, but in Northern Ireland in particular, they've shot up over the last couple of years because we focused on this methodology. What is it you want to do? What's it going to look like when you've done it? How are you going to measure the progress on the way? Those are the important questions that we need to ask within government. So we've asked some of these. What are the quality and conditions of life? Quality of life conditions we want for children, adults and families who live in our community. What would these conditions look like if we could see them? And our response to that was to build that into the framework by having a series of themes. And those themes are likely to be things with which you're familiar. We're not suggesting for a moment that these are new. Themes around health and education, the economy, the environment, perhaps something around good relations within the Northern Ireland context. How do we measure these conditions? We look at indicators. Working with NISRA colleagues, we've got 400 statisticians in the government service, and they deliver, even just in the Department of Health alone, 2,500 different data sets. So it's easy to be overpowered by the numbers. Actually, the most important thing here is to identify what are the key numbers that we want to look at, what are the relatively few things that we want to measure to really make a difference in people's lives. How are we doing on the most important of these? Who are the partners who have a role to play in that? As I say, I think that broadens out from central government into local government, the community and voluntary sector, and also an important role increasingly in Northern Ireland for the private sector. If you're going to talk about rebalancing the economy, that means to say not that we've got a bloated public sector. And as a lifelong committed career civil servant, I'm not going to accept that. What we have is an underperforming private sector, and we need to do more to encourage that and to develop that and to grow relative to the strength of the other sectors. What works to do better? And in particular, if we're using Friedman's methodology, there are a lot of things we can do that actually don't cost anything or that have very low costs attached to them. So we ought to look at those and we ought to develop them. A lot of that comes from putting the right people in the room together to decide if we are to achieve a particular outcome, what are the actions we need to take to do that? And very often, especially in a system where we haven't had joined up government, the answer to that question has come from people haven't been collaborating with each other, people haven't been talking to each other, people haven't worked jointly in order to achieve a set of outcomes, and we want to do that. So we've got a structure to this framework, which we now have to populate. Around these themes, around a specific set of outcomes, as I suggested, the themes are likely to be nothing that's going to come as a great shock to anybody. They'll be around the economy, health and education, the environment, good relations. There may be one or two others, and we'll decide how we brigade those over the next month or so in conversations with ministers and senior officials. We'll also have a number of cross-cutting outcomes underneath that. Then under those themes we'll have, I think, a relatively small number of outcomes. In total across the programme for government, I don't anticipate that we're going to have more than 15 to 20 very clearly defined, tightly prescribed outcomes that will make a difference to the lives of people. Some of the things we talked about earlier, whenever we were talking about some of the things John perhaps was talking about in the community plans, describe activities that would contribute towards an outcome. I think what we need to be much more focused on is the definition of what is that difference, what does it look like, how do we describe it? Because if you're clear about its description, you can be even clearer about what are the tools that you're going to use to measure progress towards its achievement, and then we need to be focused on that. We'll have some cross-cutting principles probably within the structure, and we'll have a set of indicators. Measurement of those outcomes against those, measurement of progress towards those outcomes, using, again, a relatively small number, thousands of data sets across government. And what we want to do is produce regular reports on the progress we're making using a small number of those indicators of progress towards those outcomes. I think one of the things that's going to be important for us as we deliver that programme, as we deliver the structure, is that we identify things that actually prevail longer than the mandate, the next electoral mandate. The assembly that comes in, it will be elected in May next year, will adopt this programme for government, and it will lead and guide the actions that it will take over the ensuing period of their tenure, over that 5-year period. But actually many of the outcomes that will be identified within the programme will have a time frame much longer than that. We should be looking at what sort of a vision we want for citizens, for the children, for the society that we live in 15 or 20 years down the road, and then identifying the actions we can take to make progress towards achieving that, fully in the knowledge that we won't achieve all of them within that short time frame. But if they're correct, if we have identified the right outcomes, we should be moving in the right direction. Okay. I'll say a few things then. So that's the structure, and try to keep within Quentin's time frame. The timeline for doing that. Like yourselves then, we've been engaged in a fairly rigorous stakeholder engagement process over the last 12 or 14 months. We've gone out and delivered a lot of evidence. And actually that process, we tried to simplify it as much as possible. We go and ask ordinary people in ordinary circumstances. We have a huge database of contacts, and we also had a survey where we ran a series of questions, randomly sampling the population, using all the demographic profiles, younger people, older people. We've tested all of the Section 75 categories. We've held one-to-one interviews with a huge number of people. We've held a series of focus groups, again focusing on the Section 75 categories, and we asked them questions about what does the government do well? What would you like it to do more of? What does it do badly? And one of the questions I think that Neil alluded to, what are the things we're doing at the moment that really we ought to stop? Because we do work within finite resources, and we need to find ways to fund things where we want to do more or we want to do better. And in order to do that, we're going to have to stop doing some of the things that we've done less well, or perhaps that we've reprioritised and they think are less important towards achieving those headline outcomes that we want to achieve. So we gathered all that evidence together and we brigaded it, and then we tested against the data that the public sector already holds. What does that say about the issues we're already tackling, where we're putting our resources, what sort of a return are we already getting from that? And we're about to put that literally tomorrow to our stage 1 engagement on looking for political direction. Tomorrow and Thursday we've got a series of engagements where we're going to lock in a room the permanent secretaries of all the departments and the representatives of the political parties represented currently on the executive. And we're going to say to them, you define for us what these outcomes are that we ought to achieve. And we'll provide them, by way of their starter for 10, the information we've garnered from that engagement exercise. What did people say was important to them? You'll not be astonished by some of the answers. Most important thing for most people in Northern Ireland is their health, their physical health and their mental health and well-being. Second most important thing were their personal finances, and so on. And we went through a series of these issues and we tested that against the data in terms of public sector interventions and our ability to make a difference to the outcomes in respect of those issues. And we're providing that information to those workshops over the next 2 days and asking them to define for us what those outcomes might look like. Whenever we've got a first draft of what they might look like, our proposal is that we'll take that out then into a series of thematic workshops which are likely to happen next month in January, where we'll go into greater detail then around the definition of those outcomes and perhaps particularly the indicators we're going to use to measure progress towards achieving them. So I'll expect those thematic outcomes to happen next month. And then again we'll go out from those and look at the collegiality that we want to promote in this. None of these outcomes are going to be achievable by a single government department working on its own in order to achieve deliver on a particular activity to deliver these outcomes. These outcomes will require joined up activity between central government and local government, between local and central government and the community and voluntary sector and others. One of the things we have to look at is the way in which all of that is going to be funded. There will be, in cash terms, a slightly increasing amount coming into the block grant on the current forecasts, but that's likely to face ever-growing pressures. We have to find other and newer ways in which we can resource what it is we're trying to do and try to deliver on that. Departments under a new structure, because we're moving from 12 government departments to 9 government departments after the election in May next year. We'll have to look at what are the business plans they're going to deliver in order to deliver on those outcomes that have been identified. All of that goes into a process which, according to the Stormont House Agreement of last year, said to us that the politicians who will take up office in ministerial seats after the next election will have 1 week to resolve their programme for government. So the reason we're doing all this preparatory work now is so that we will have a draft to afford them the opportunity to look at what are the strategic alliances and coalitions that they will need to forge within that government structure in order to have the best opportunity to deliver on those outcomes that have been identified by the process. That will then go through a public consultation process and become the actual programme that will drive the actions of the public sector from the middle of next year. And then we get into an implementation phase. So there's a lot of work to be done between now and then. And the important thing, and I'll relate back again to perhaps how Neil finished his presentation. This is a new process and it's not something with which any of us have a great deal of familiarity. And therefore, the realistic expectation is the first time you do it, you won't get it entirely right. But you have to stick with it, because we believe this is the right way to be moving forward, this is the right way to do it. And in particular, engaging new people who haven't been engaged in the delivery of government in this way before. It's a more democratic way to do things, and we hope it's going to be a more successful way to do things. I think it does tailor itself to what community plans have suggested, but I think also as part of the reflection going forward, those who are preparing the community plans need to think about the way they tailor those to the work that's going on within Programme for Government. Thanks for your time.